Good morning, and thank you all for coming. I am truly excited about this day because we have been talking about this day for a long time. And I got to tell you, today you're going to hear some good stuff, a powerful resolution, some powerful stories about childhood trauma. And childhood trauma, and I don't need to tell you, but the governor has taken it as a priority to start addressing issues in child and families. So I am excited for today. So let me start by saying thank you again for coming and joining us on this incredible prevalent issue that plagues hundreds of thousands of Ohio's children each and every day. Specifically in, 2017-2018 National Survey of Children's Health found that more than 500,000 children had at least one adverse childhood experience, known as ACEs, and more than 400,000 had at least two. According to the American Academy of Pediatrics, who's here today, ACEs can be caused by many different things: divorce, death of a parent, jail time for a parent, violence, substance abuse in the home, etc. Little personal story. Last month, I had a neighbor, a Latino family. The husband, and while we were up here voting on bills, the father of this family was up in a tree. He cut down a limb of his tree, fell and died right in front of their home. Could you imagine what took place in that family after that tragedy? It didn't just shake the family, it shook the whole neighborhood. Everyone was traumatized by just that one death, that tragic death that occurred. But what was more interesting is those children, the next day had to go to school. They didn't have a day off. The parent had to go to work. She didn't have a day off. And that type of thing happens each and every day. That type of traumatic experience happens each and every day. While it shook our neighborhood and it shook each and every one of us, this happens to thousands of children each and every day. And today we're here to really talk about the adverse effects that happens with African American children, Latino children. Those children are not just impacted by the traumatic experiences that they see each and every day in their homes. They're also affected by all the traumatic experiences that happen in our system of care. When they go to schools, when they're involved in our criminal justice system, when they're actually addressing in all of our system of care, the system that's supposed to be there to help them, oftentimes don't realize, but sometimes they're hurting them by not understanding the trauma that has occurred to each and every one of them. And that's why we are here today. When we see these experiences, what we do know is that the health problems are also so many. We have substance abuse, addiction, also leads to heart disease, leads to obesity, just to name a few. But these problems are also developmental. Trauma severely impacts child's development and learning, as well as their mental health and their behavioral health. We also know that ACEs are more common in communities of color, and that our children in those communities face big barriers. To that end, the American Psychological Association recognizes that racism as a contributing factor to trauma for them. It is crucial that we make this evidence-based distinction, and keep in mind that while children of all backgrounds are affected, children of color faces these experiences at higher rates. We see it in our neighborhoods, our classrooms, everywhere between our children are suffering from what is happening around them, and consequently it's devastating. We see it each and every day. The time is now to raise awareness of how prominent childhood trauma is and treat this issue like it is the crisis that it is. That is why Representative Upchurch and myself are introducing this concurrent resolution urging the governor to declare a state of emergency on childhood trauma. We must do more to ensure that our children can grow up and live happy, healthy, and productive lives in our state. On that note, I'd like to introduce Ron Humas, an incredibly passionate young man who came up here from Cincinnati with a compelling story, which started this whole ball off and started us to really start looking at these incidents in African American children. Ron. Thank you.
Bear with me, I am really nervous right now.
That is nice.
So I'm gonna give you a short synopsis of my trauma story. So I was conceived by rape. I was adopted at the age of 5 to a man that tried to beat the meat off my bones. At the age of 12, my mother helped me find my biological father, who was a crack addict and a heroin addict. We slept in abandoned houses and went days without food at times. See, I didn't understand trauma at this time. I was wired for a life of survival. So what we understand trauma to be now was normalcy for a lot of us. Even through all of the chaotic experiences, I understood trauma just as a way of life. But even with all those experiences, dropped out of school in the 10th grade, went to prison in the 90s, and lived a childhood of abuse and abandonment, I still went on to be a successful entrepreneur, author, philanthropist. But even with those accomplishments, I still never associated all of this connected with trauma. See, I never connected the chronic pain, the fibromyalgia, waking up in the morning and having to crawl to the bathroom from the excruciating pain. See, these pieces, they to me personally, they didn't connect with trauma, because most of us, especially in the African American community, really don't understand the impact of it and how it plays out long term in our life. And honestly, it wasn't until the suicide death of my son, who lost his battle to PTSD and depression, that I started to put the pieces together, that this wasn't normal. I needed answers. So I decided to take free classes that was offered by NAMI, and I also went on to get my mental health first aid certificate and took some behavior disorder classes to really get an understanding of what this monster was we were dealing with. And it was during that journey that I actually learned that African American children suffer from PTSD on epidemic levels. And my heart broke. Over 500,000 children are suffering from this disease at no fault of their own. And there was not one initiative, no policies to impact this crisis. There was no one even talking about it. That's when I knew that I was molded for this battle. So I decided, you know what? A radical issue like this deserves a radical response. So December 18, 2018, I decided to do a 48-hour hunger strike on the steps of the State House. Columbus cold is not like Cincinnati's cold. You can go 2 hours down and it's 20 degrees warmer. So December 18th, it was really cold, and as I was out there, I remember 1 o'clock in the morning, I was just standing on the curb with these banners that I had made at the Cincinnati Library, their Create Space department, that just said, "State of Emergency on Childhood Trauma." And I thought, what am I doing? I mean, am I really gonna make a difference? I was out there alone. Reached out to a number of community leaders to stand with me, and nobody thought this issue was big enough to, take on this plight. So I decided, you know what, I'll do it alone. I remember at times while I was out there, My fingers would go numb. My toes were numb. There were times I actually thought I would die. And a number of times, honestly, I was tempted to go get in my car and drive back to Cincinnati and just give up. But I would think about those children that are suffering here in Ohio and all over the country. They go to school every day and can't even function. A lot of them go to school just for a meal. And then I heard my go-to ancestor, Mandela, voice in my head said, "Stay the course, young man, stay the course." So I did. Never really thinking how big this really could get or the impact that it could have. I just knew that something had to be done. So I was out there for 48 hours trying to raise awareness on PTSD in African American children on an epidemic level, but also to try to convince our legislators to make Ohio the first state to execute a state of emergency on childhood trauma. And we're gaining a lot of ground with that. This policy is historic. There's never been anything like it, and for Ohio to lead the way for such a historic policy, we're talking about, man, a policy that's gonna bring generational healing to thousands here in Ohio and lead the way. So I'm grateful for that. So I'm going to end it there, and I want to introduce Ms. LaShonda Suggs of Labor of Love Counseling.
Thanks, Ron. So good morning. I think Representative West started us off with a lot of information that some of us may not have known regarding numbers. And I truly thank you, Ron, for sharing your story of vulnerability and how we got here. I think the most important thing I would like to share with people today is, just like Ron said, most of the children that we are attempting to provide services and resources for and to help do not realize that they are experiencing trauma. Likewise, the people who are servicing them in schools and in hospitals and mental health facilities also do not recognize that they are experiencing trauma. One of the greatest accomplishments that I believe this resolution and the following legislation can achieve is helping to re-script the narrative around African American and other marginalized children when it comes to trauma. Right now, the narrative is delinquency, criminality, lack of motivation, poor home training, all of these narratives that we give. So when people who are experts even in mental health go to address these children, they're not looking for symptoms of trauma. They're looking at how do we stop the bad behavior. So with the education necessary to help people understand not only trauma, we're looking to move beyond trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care simply tells you that trauma exists. We're moving towards trauma-responsive care, and that is going to require a cultural humility in order for us to actually impact the lives that we're talking about. So as a therapist and a trauma specialist, I see on a regular basis that when we are talking about certain populations, we say, that was rough. They must have been traumatized. But we don't understand that for African American children and other marginalized children, it's not just a single event. It's entire systems that have been built to not only perpetuate the traumas that these children are experiencing, but to maintain it. And so that's across all systems: law enforcement, education, medical, right? So from the time these children wake up to the time they go to sleep, they are inundated with experiences that keep them in the cycle of trauma. So this legislation is extremely important for us to understand that in order to help these children, we have to understand these children. And if we try to move without the cultural humility that will allow us to go beyond the stories that we've been given about these children, we'll continue to do the same things that we've been doing with very limited success. And so I'm very excited to be a part of this, and I thank Representatives West, Upchurch, and those others who are supporting us. I thank Ron for starting it off and for building a network and a team to move this forward, because at this point, it's not just important, it's imperative. And we are talking about a national crisis. We are talking about a public health crisis. And because it doesn't have sometimes physical evidence that people are looking for, it continues to be ignored. And so we are serving notice that it is here. And I hope that notice is heard because we're not going away. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. Andrew Seamus, who is with The Ohio State University.
Thank you, and I just want to say how really honored I am to be on this stage at this moment with these people who've worked so hard on this issue, and I'm really optimistic about it going forward. My name is Andrew Seamus. I'm a medical doctor and an associate professor in the Division of General Internal Medicine at The Ohio State University. I'm speaking now as a member of the Physicians Action Network, a group of Ohio physicians who advocate for healthcare access, reproductive rights, healthy communities, and other issues that affect our patients. In my practice, I see many patients who have been victims of childhood trauma. By childhood trauma, I mean that they were exposed to physical or sexual abuse, emotional patients who've had these experiences. In population studies, about 1/3 of people report at least one adverse childhood experience, as defined above, and about 10% have had multiple traumas. What's less well recognized is that these experiences have lifelong effects on health and well-being. Kids who've been traumatized often become depressed, anxious, hypervigilant, and impulsive. They suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, which can go unrecognized in school. They are labeled as behavior problems and suffer academically. Kids who've been traumatized are often the ones in whom you see risky sexual behavior, sexually transmitted infections, unplanned pregnancies, substance abuse, serious injuries, and at worst, teen suicide. The consequences continue into adulthood with higher rates of depression, addiction, suicide, diabetes, and cancer. Kids who are struggling emotionally can end up disadvantaged with relation to their peers. Their experience of trauma can impact their school performances, their job prospects, their long-term relationships, and their ability to parent their own children, leading to a cycle in which trauma is passed down from one generation to the next. Medical science is beginning to recognize the effects of trauma. Affected persons can be treated effectively and can go on to have healthy, successful lives. But treatment is not always available to those who need it most. The burden of trauma falls most heavily on communities of color, communities that have suffered historical displacement and inequality, communities that are under-resourced and socially marginalized. In these communities, adverse childhood experiences are so widespread that their impact can go unrecognized by the very educators and healthcare providers who would be in a position to help. In these communities, the path to treatment and recovery for trauma survivors is difficult, often impossible to navigate. The state of Ohio has already taken some important steps. I'd like to call attention particularly to the Department of Addiction and Mental Health Services, whose staff has worked tirelessly on this issue over the years with the resources available to them. But much more is needed. That's why this resolution to declare a state of emergency on childhood trauma is so important. Looking at the profound health effects of multiple trauma, the large number of Ohioans affected, and the impact on entire communities, I believe that we must do more to help traumatized children and adults. Passing this resolution should be a starting point, not an end in itself. Not only do I hope to see this bill pass, I hope it will be followed by legislation to improve screening, identification of affected children, and the allocation of resources to treat battered communities. I and the Physicians Action Network are proud to stand with Ron Hummons, LaShonda Suggs, Representatives West and Upchurch, and the others here today in support of this resolution. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Representative Upchurch.
Thank you, Doctor. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Representative West for allowing me the opportunity to join him in this effort. I want to thank all our speakers here today. You all have heard the stories, and we've heard some facts today, and it's obvious that this is a national crisis, and certainly here in the state of Ohio, it is a state of emergency, and we are past the point of bringing awareness. The hour of action begins now. Obviously, I have a unique understanding of child trauma because I represent one of the most impoverished districts in the state of Ohio, predominantly African American. So I have seen child trauma firsthand, and I've seen the links to addiction and drug abuse, gun violence, as well as poverty. So this is something that I believe that all of Ohio can get behind, as it's not just an urban issue, but it's certainly a rural issue too. So I'm looking forward to getting this concurrent resolution passed and beginning to follow up with legislation that will really begin to make some steps to move Ohio in the right direction, because we can lead the nation in addressing this issue. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up, and then we'll open it up for questions. Thank you.
We also have with us Tri-State Trauma Network with us as well. So at this point in time, we'll open up for any questions, please. Any questions?
Representative, can you talk us through the strategy of starting with a resolution instead of starting with a bill that might provide more funding for various programs? I mean, just more specific details on things that could be done to maybe lessen this problem.
Yes, thank you. I'll first start with how this all began. Of course, it started with Ron coming to the State House and saying, you know, and Ron probably can speak a little bit better to this. When we had the IP meeting, Ron came and he said, you know, I wanted a state of emergency, because he modeled it after the state of emergency on opioid crises. And you want to speak to that, Ron? Here, tell me.
So what I knew was that there was a problem and we were in a crisis. So I didn't really know necessarily what to do, but so as a consultant for many years, one of the things that I would do for my clients was I would never, so I'm giving you all a secret, I would never tell them I couldn't do it or I didn't know. I would just find a successful model and duplicate it. What was the best successful model to use? Was the state of emergency on opioids. Perfect. I mean, it was implemented with urgency. The impact was huge, and we already see the numbers reducing with that policy. So I decided, you know what, that's what I'm going to model this after, and hope for the same urgency and impact that did.
Thank you. And I think the other thing is, you know, and we took it and said, you know what, we talked about the state of emergency, the statement, but this is a state of emergency, because this is an issue that has been impacting communities for a year, for many, many, many years. That's gone unnoticed. And now it's time for us to address it. And we believe that this is the right approach, coming forward with a resolution, followed by legislation. As you heard the doctor say, he talked a little bit about how we are looking at trying to make certain that we provide screening and resources so that people are identifying this throughout the system of care, right? So when kids are going to school and you're starting to see behaviors that come up, you know, those should be red flags that something's going on. It was interesting because I was at the Congressional Black Caucus Conference, and one of the things that I walked in on was a book called Push Out, and it was about an African-American young lady who was, I guess, experienced traumatic experiences in school. This girl was a very good student, but for some reason was always being picked on because she was a little different than some of the other kids. So this girl ended up getting kicked out of the classroom, right? And she was feeling bad about herself because she told her parents, and her parents, you know, thought it was her, and she didn't have anybody there supporting her. This girl ended up walking out of school. No one knew she was gone, and then she contemplated suicide. Thankfully, that didn't happen. But as a result of her story, now there's a book out that talks about the criminalization of African-American girls, right? These are things that we have to start looking at. How do we screen our children so that they are not feeling bad about themselves, so that they don't end up in criminal justice systems, so that they don't, you know, end up in worse traumatic experiences. Once someone starts feeling bad about themselves, you know, they start to go down further. And that's something that I believe that this resolution is going to start bringing attention to. Does anybody else want to speak to that? Yes, sir.
Yes, this is Lawrence Jones with Greater Black Cincinnati Politics. I'd like to know, in regards to the bill, What type of support has it garnered? I mean, is this bipartisan? Who is supporting this? Are there any co-sponsors?
So we haven't dropped the resolution yet, as I understand. So we haven't dropped the resolution yet or introduced it, but I certainly do intend to have bipartisan support for the resolution as well as a variety of co-sponsors. Because like I mentioned earlier, I mean, this is not just an urban issue, but this is something that's rural and it's happening all across the state of Ohio.
Okay, no, we dropped the resolution, we didn't get the number yet.
Right, okay.
Yes. So we have, currently, we have
got 8.
8 people that's on board with it. We dropped it, I believe, relatively short. We dropped it and we wanted to get as many people on as possible. The other thing is we have had communication. Matter of fact, this issue initially, before Ron came to my office, a Republican came to me and said he wanted to work with me on this bill. And that was how it also started, because when he came in my doors, I was almost prepared for you, Ron, because I had a little heads up before I got over to my office, and lo and behold, Ron was there. But their stories, and of course LaShonda's work, truly is the real story, and saying this is what's going on, not only in Canton, Ohio, but also in Cincinnati and throughout the state of Ohio. And it's time that we address this issue. So my goal is to get everybody on board. You know, who cannot get on board with childhood trauma, right? Go ahead.
Hi, Melissa Adamchak. I'm Executive Director of the Tri-State Trauma Network, and we support agencies and professionals doing the work around trauma survivors and trauma healing in Southwest Ohio, Northern Kentucky, and Southeast Indiana. So I just want to say the time is ripe for this. I've been running this network for 5 years. People are ready, forces have come together, and this is the time for this to get passed and to make a huge impact. And I love that it's happening in Ohio, and I'm going to take notes and send them over to Kentucky and Indiana. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, and I should also mention that I've been in touch with the medical societies, the Ohio State Medical Association, the Franklin County Medical Association. There's a process they have for making an organizational decision to commit, and I certainly don't want to jump the gun. But the staff and leadership I've talked to have been very supportive, very interested in the process. And, you know, there's also a representative from the university here who's keeping a close eye on this. I think that this is something that the mainstream medical community could certainly get behind. I hope they will get behind. I think there's a good prospect of that. I'll also note that Bill Cotton is here from the American Academy of Pediatrics. So at the level of medical organizations, I think this is something that could be very strongly supported.
And let me also say, when we first jumped out of the, we wanted this to be our first start. We wanted a press conference. Let's make people aware of this issue. And then we were going to come back and follow. I've also made contact with the governor's office to have a sit-down meeting with him. And also, we're looking at then reaching out to all the different organizations to be on board with this resolution. So, yes.
And the timeline to get legislation passed?
One more time.
Could you just address the timeline to get legislation passed and get?
Yes, yes. So basically with this resolution, as we move forward, we will plan on, we've already dropped it, so we're waiting for a non-voting session, which is probably tomorrow, I believe, and hopefully then they will go ahead and sign it a number, and then the process will be, then it will be assigned to a committee. Then, of course, we'll go forward from there.
So let's assume the resolution goes forward and there's a state of emergency declared. What do you view as a next step in terms of legislation?
Yes, and I believe that's what we're also looking at, is sitting down with Representative Upchurch is going to also partner. We're going to try to do a bipartisan bill to address the screening, to address the carve-out, and that will focus on African-American children. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. Name's Luna Malmore from Cincinnati. LaShonda spoke to cultural humility, and I think that's a term that not everybody is aware of. So I'm wondering if you could expand on that and speak to specifically why this is focused on supporting African American children and why cultural humility is needed connected to this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I believe a term that most people are familiar with is cultural competence, right? That is this word that's put out that a person who has not had the lived experience of another person can somehow become competent in those lived experiences and provide adequate care. What we're finding is people striving for competence is not equipping them with the humility to realize that their own lived experiences do not mirror or match those of other people. So the term cultural humility actually takes the weight off of trying to become competent, but instead emphasizing empathy, compassion, and understanding, which we can achieve as humans, versus a competency that most of us will never achieve. And so with that, we are striving to help people understand that it's not just about understanding trauma and saying, let's go help these poor Black and brown kids. It really is about understanding how systems that were rooted and created in this country were intentionally perpetuated to get us where we are today. And it requires people to be able to take a humble stance to see how they've benefited from those systems and how difficult it will be to let go of the systems that we're trying to infiltrate and change. And so it is a term that, instead of making people feel like there's a certificate they can achieve or receive because they're now competent in this area, it means it is a lifelong striving that we will continuously have to put ourselves in a humble position in order to understand how we got here and how we're going to get out. But that was an excellent question. To the point about why specifically African American children, I like to use the phrase emphasis on, not exclusion of. We can spend weeks debating whether or not other people other than African American children experience trauma, and the answer is, of course they do. However, with the emphasis on African American and other marginalized communities, we then have to take note of the systems that I've previously spoken about. And so when an entire group of people have been systemically oppressed, and this is the result, we have to go back and address very specifically those communities from a systemic level. And if we are coming at this from that perspective, there's not a single child of any color, race, or creed that can be overlooked by our changes in our systems, but we have to start where the greatest need is. And when left to, doesn't everyone experience, that's how we got here. There's not a lack of policy on trauma-informed care. Yet there seems to be a lack of emphasis on the communities that are genuinely suffering. And so that is why we have that emphasis. And hopefully if people are able to humble themselves enough to hear what I just said, there will be an opportunity for people to say, how could we not? Which is what we're looking for. Thank you for the question.
Representative West, two things. First, you mentioned that you've reached out to the governor's office to sit down with them. Any feedback from them so far, if they're willing to do so?
No, I actually reached out to Dan last week when I was here last week, and I have not yet heard back, but I'm sure we'll hear back this week.
Okay. And my other question for you, just to give us a sense for, if you're going to follow up this resolution with a bill with funding for screening or other sorts of things, can you give us a sense for the scale of how much might need to be done by the state in order to make a meaningful difference on this issue?
I don't have that information, but I know it would be pretty large. But one of the things that we do, we have to start. We have to make some start. If we do a carve out through Medicaid and really focus on being very intentional about addressing this issue through a system of care approach, meaning all of our systems, our education, our child welfare, our human services, our social services, everybody's aware of trauma-informed or trauma-responsive care. That's a start. Then we start looking at trying to address the screening through that. They can start screening right now without money, and I believe that a lot of people already been talking about trauma for a long time, but we really haven't started addressing the issue of trauma, kids that are traumatized, and then also being traumatized by the very system that's there designed to help them. Does that make sense? And I think that even if they start changing their ways, and I think as LaShonda had mentioned, even when we're addressing the issue of cultural and understanding racism and how that plays effect and how that's an additional traumatized experience on an individual. And then what that does to that person. I don't think those are the conversations we've been having across the globe, and I think it's important that we start. And I don't believe that actually requires dollars. That requires someone to be intentional about starting that process. Yes, ma'am.
A lot of you have spoken to this, but I just want to reiterate, when the shootings happened in Dayton and El Paso, Governor DeWine called for that pediatric summit to be held in Dayton. The and he was very clear on wanting to commit a lot of resources and support to address trauma. Majority, if not all, of the presenters were white. There was a disproportionate amount of people of color, colleagues of color, educators, not only being represented and having their voice at the table, but it wasn't named. So I think there's a power in the resolution that's naming racism at the root. What do you say to the people who say, he's already said this is all the resources are already going toward trauma? So I think if and when pushback comes, what support do you guys need to make this a broader issue and not let's just wait? We're already putting resources.
Well, and I'm glad you said that because, yes, the governor in that particular situation in Dayton, and it took that in Dayton to be a national, headline in order for us to move, for us to act. But this is something that happens in our neighborhoods and our communities each and every year. When suicides happen in a certain neighborhood, everybody gets panicking, and that we put out resources, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we need to be very clear that this is happening in communities across the state of Ohio each and every day, and that we need to be certain that we're very intentional about not just addressing the issues and putting the resources in a state of emergency in Dayton, but throughout the whole state of Ohio, because the kids in Northeast Ohio is suffering just as well as in Southeast Ohio. Thank you. And I think the other part of it is making certain that we're all, after this press conference goes forward, is that we are also calling our legislators and saying how important this is. Because this is not, and I also want to preference this, anytime that there is an issue that affects African Americans, people look to the African American legislators to address the issue. There's 99 legislators here. We all need to address this issue. We all have constituents in our neighborhoods, in our constituency, and we all must address it. We have to fulfill the Ohio promise of making certain that people can live, work, and play and be safety and security right here in the state of Ohio, and we all need to address that. Yes, please, Bill.
Hi, Bill Cotton from the Ohio Academy of Pediatrics. One of the things would be screening for this, and that's very important. But one of the things that could certainly shoot it in the foot if there's screening and no funding for treatment. Nothing worse than finding out you've got a problem but no way to fix it. Yes. So that it has to be hand-in-hand screening and resources for treatment.
Well, if there's no other questions, let me also give a great shout out to the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services for as a resource. They've been working on this issue of trauma for 7 years, and I was very happy to hear that. But now moving forward, we'll also be a little bit more intentional in trying to address the issues of African American children and Latino children and Native American children and all those kids that are experiencing other factors as well. Thank you.